Welcome back to episode 62, reading about 10 minutes a day of the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And today we're reading still from Morris and Linda Tannehill from The Market for Liberty in 1970. And we're starting this episode off about a third of the way down on page 241. A basic expense factor is the cost of any property stolen, damaged, or destroyed. The aggressor would be required to return any stolen property still in his possession. If he had destroyed a replaceable item, such as a television set, he would have to pay the victim an amount of money equal to its value so that the victim could replace it. If the aggressor had destroyed an item which couldn't be replaced but which had a market value, for example, a famous artwork like the Mona Lisa, he would still have to pay its market value even though another one couldn't be bought. The principle here is that even though the value can never be replaced, the victim should at least be left no worse off financially than if he had sold it instead of losing it to a thief. Justice requires the aggressor to compensate the victim insofar as is humanly possible, and replacing an irreplaceable value is impossible. In addition to the basic expense of stolen and destroyed property, an act of aggression may cause several additional costs, for which the aggressor would be responsible to pay. An aggressor who stole a salesman's car might cause the salesman to lose quite a bit of business, an additional financial cost. A rapist who attacked and beat a woman would be responsible not only for paying medical bills for all injuries he had caused her and reparations for time she might lose from work, but he would also owe his victim compensation for her pain and suffering, both mental and physical. Besides all debts owed to the primary victim, the aggressor might also owe secondary reparations to others who had suffered indirectly because of his actions, for example, the victim's family. In addition to these expenses occasioned by the aggression itself, the aggressor would also be responsible for any reasonable costs involved in apprehending him and for the cost of arbitration, which would probably be paid by the loser in any case. Since the arbitration agency's service would be the rendering of just decisions, and since justice is the basis on which they would compete in the market, the arbiters would make every attempt to fix reparations at a fair level, in accordance with market values. For instance, if the defense company had run up an excessively high bill in apprehending the aggressor, the arbiters would refuse to charge the aggressor for the excessive expense. Thus, the defense company would be forced to pay for its own poor business practices instead of, quote, passing the buck to someone else. In case the reparations amounted to more than the aggressor could possibly earn in his lifetime, for example, an unskilled laborer who set $1 million fire, the insurance company and any other claimants would negotiate a settlement for whatever amount he could reasonably be expected to pay over time. This would be done because it would be no profit to them to set the reparations higher than the aggressor could ever hope to pay, and thus discourage him from working to discharge his obligation. It is worth noting here that quite a large percentage of a worker's pay can be taken for a long period of time without totally removing his incentive to live and work. At present, the average American pays out well over a third of his income in taxes and expects to do so for the rest of his life. Yet those who go on the government, quote, welfare dole are still in the minority. Many values which can be destroyed or damaged by aggression are not only irreplaceable, they are also non-exchangeable. That is, they can't be exchanged in the market, so no monetary value can be placed on them. Examples of non-exchangeable values are life, a hand or eye, the life of a loved one, the safety of a kidnapped child, etc. When confronted with the problem of fixing the amount of reparations for a non-exchangeable value, many people immediately ask, quote, but how can you set a price on human life? The answer is that when an arbitration agency sets the reparations for a loss of life, it isn't trying to put a monetary price on that life, any more than is an insurance company when it sells a $20,000 life insurance policy. It is merely trying to compensate the victim or his survivors to the fullest extent possible under the circumstances. The problem in fixing reparations for loss of life or limb is that the loss occurred in one kind of value, non-exchangeable, and repayment must be made in another kind, money. These two kinds of values are incommensurable. Neither can be measured in terms of the other. The value which has been destroyed not only can't be replaced with a similar value, it can't even be replaced with an equivalent sum of money, since there is no way to determine what is equivalent. And yet, monetary payment is the practical way to make reparations. It is useful to remember here that justice consists of requiring the aggressor to compensate his victims for their losses insofar as it is humanly possible. Since no one can be expected to do the impossible, even a destroyed item which has a market value can't always be replaced, for example, the Mona Lisa. To demand that justice require the impossible is to make justice impossible. To reject the reparations system because it can't always replace the destroyed value with an equivalent value is like rejecting medicine because the patient can't always be restored to as good a state of health as he enjoyed before his illness. Justice, like medicine, must be contextual, and it must not demand what is impossible in any given context. The question, then, is not how arbiters can set a price on life and limb. It is rather, quote, how can they see that the victim is fairly compensated, insofar as is humanly possible, without doing injustice to the aggressor by requiring overcompensation? In attempting to reach a fair compensation figure, the arbitration agency would act not as a judge handing down a sentence, but as a mediator resolving a conflict which the disputants can't settle themselves. The highest possible limit on the amount of reparations is, obviously, the aggressor's ability to pay, short of killing his incentive to live and earn. The lowest limit is the total amount of economic loss suffered, with no compensation for such non-exchangeables as anxiety, discomfort, and inconvenience. The reparations payment must be set somewhere in the broad range between these two extremes. The function of the arbitration agency would be to aid the disputants in reaching a reasonable figure between these extremes, not to achieve the impossible task of determining the monetary value of a non-exchangeable. Although the limits within which the reparations payment for a non-exchangeable would be set are very broad, the arbitration agency could not capriciously set the amount of reparations at any figure it pleased. An arbitration agency would be a private business competing in a free market, and the action of the market itself would provide guidelines and controls regarding the, quote, price of aggression, just as it does with any other price. Any free market business, including an arbitration agency, can survive and prosper only as customers choose to patronize it instead of its competitors. An arbitration agency must be chosen by both or all disputants in a case, which means that its record of settling previous disputes of a similar nature must be more satisfactory to both complainant and defendant than the records of its competitors. Any arbitration agency which consistently set reparations too high or too low, in the opinion of the majority of its customers and potential customers, would lose business rapidly. It would have to either adjust its payments to fit consumer demand or go out of business. In this way, arbitration agencies whose level of reparation displeased consumers would be weeded out, as would any other business which failed to satisfy customers. Arbitration agencies which wanted to stay in business would adjust reparation levels to meet consumer demand. In a relatively short time, reparations payments for various non-exchangeable losses would become pretty well standardized, just as are charges for various kinds and amounts of insurance protection. The manner in which the amount of reparations for a non-exchangeable value would be set by the action of the free market is very similar to the way in which the market sets any price. No good or service has an intrinsic monetary value built into it by the nature of things. A commodity has a particular monetary value because that amount of money is what buyers are willing to give for it and sellers are willing to take for it. Quote, value means value to the people who trade that commodity in the market. All the traders determine what the price will be. In a similar way, the people who bought the services of arbitration agencies would determine the levels of reparations payments, the levels they considered just and fair compensation for various kinds of losses. It is impossible for us to foresee, in advance of the actual market situation, just where these levels would be set. But we can see, from a knowledge of how a free market operates, that the market would determine them in accordance with consumer desires. And we'll stop right there, about 3/4 of the way down on page 244, and be back soon, reading another 10 minutes of the Anarchist Handbook.